Welcome to the Haws Corporation webinar presentation of ADA and drinking fountain compliance, all you need to know. In order to receive a certificate and credit, you will need to attend for the duration of the presentation. Within 24 hours of this session being completed, you will receive an email from AEC Daily with a link to access your certificate. Your credit will be reported to the AIA within 10 business days. We thank you and we hope you enjoy the presentation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Justin Dunn to take it away.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our presentation. Greatly appreciate you being here. This is the ADA and drinking fountain compliance. We're going to cover everything from head to toe in the ADA as it pertains to hydration and drinking fountains in public. So as we dig into this, and as I move into the presentation, and all the requirements that I'm about to cover, these apply to, much more than just drinking fountains, of course, but drinking fountains are going to be the focus of the presentation today and how the ADA affects that equipment in public. Okay. Now, also consider as we move through this that all of you have your own state and local laws to adhere to, so ensure that those are taken into consideration as well. State and local standards must be stricter than what is currently in place at the federal level, which is what we're digging into, the federal standard for compliance. That's me on the left, Justin Dunn, Senior Field Marketing Specialist, been with the company for 9 years now, and I absolutely love it here at Haws. Consider myself quite this specialist when it comes to the ADA, ANSI standards, and so on, and I'm really happy to be here doing this for you. With me is my partner in crime, if he'll introduce himself real quick.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. My name is Hayden Delgado. I'm a specification manager with Haws. Been with Haws for about 6 years now and looking forward to another good ADA webinar today.
So we're both super excited that you guys are here. Thank you very much. There are a lot of you here. We really greatly appreciate that. And we really hope you appreciate and enjoy the content that we have for you today. Now with that, as you follow along and we move through this presentation, post questions. If you have questions about the material or Haws or anything, post those questions in the questions section on the control panel. Any questions that we can't address here on the presentation, etc., will be answered in a follow-up. We'll send out an Excel spreadsheet listing those questions along with our answers to those questions. Okay, we're also going to launch a couple poll questions. They'll be short and sweet, but they really help us to continue to improve this for you. And to kind of keep our finger on the pulse as far as the industry goes and make sure we're providing you with what you need. So those will be launched throughout the presentation and your participation is greatly appreciated. Now, that follow-up email that I mentioned is going to be sent after the presentation. So give us a couple days to put that material together, to answer those questions, get the documents together, and then we'll send that off to you. And it will include an on-demand recording. So you can follow the link, watch the recording, share it, whatever it is that you would like or need to do. The presentation slides in PDF format, so you can take those, you can save them, you can reuse them as needed. Some additional support materials from Haws, also CEU instructions. If you're having trouble, if you need to reach out to us, if you need help, etc., all will be explained in the follow-up email. And thankfully we have AEC Daily to help us with that, and then the Q&A, of course, will be in there as well. So with that out of the way, we have a couple pieces of business, and then we're getting right into the standards and digging in. Now, quickly, just a bit about us, and after the agenda that I'm about to cover in a moment, a little bit of info about the ADA and its origins. Now, our founder, pictured in the bottom left there, is Luther Haws. He invented the world's first sanitary drinking fountain bubbler head in 1906. amidst the Ban the Cup movements, and formed the Haws Sanitary Drinking Fountain Company in 1909 in Berkeley, California. Luther was working as a sanitation inspector for Berkeley when he had the thought to invent a device that would prevent users from spreading germs and disease through public hydration. And that device was the drinking fountain bubbler head. Pre-Luther Haws and his invention, it was commonplace to see public fountains with constant running water, which isn't so uncommon in the rest of the world today, but you'll stoop and drink from a bubbler or a spout rather than what was the preferred method pre-1900s, which was to utilize a cup that was anchored to the fountain via a chain. And you would pick up that cup and fill it and have yourself a drink and then drop the cup and the next person would use it. And that had obvious public sanitation issues. Some of the common diseases being spread during that time were cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery, all of which were potentially fatal and spread from mouth to cup to mouth. And lucky for us, Luther put his inventive mind to the task and he found a solution that has continued to benefit public health and safety to this day. And just a fun fact, his first prototype was actually a brass bedpost that he used for that, which is kind of cool. And today, Haws is located in Sparks, Nevada, where we work tirelessly to improve the health and safety of our global community. Hayden and I are pulling all-nighters, making sure you guys are safe and healthy and happy. So moving on to the agenda, we're going to do an overview of that ADA legislation for drinking fountains. We're going to cover common ADA installation issues. Hayden's going to cover that. ADA compliant drinking fountains and bottle filler in stations, because we want you to see how to do it correctly. Hygienic hydration solutions, ways to further improve public hydration and current solutions and devices. And then an ADA Q&A. We had some questions submitted that we're going to cover, and we'll get through those at the end of, towards the end of the webinar. But first and foremost, I mentioned it earlier, before we really get into it, this is our last piece of business here. It's really important to remember that this is civil rights legislation, and not just that, but the ADA legislation was the first major legislation to treat disability rights as a civil rights issue. Prior to the standard and its inception, accessibility was up to the business and was infrequently available. People didn't want to spend the money to update their businesses and thought that your handicap was your problem. It wasn't up to them to have to bend the world to your will. And there were no teeth in any former requirements to provide access to buildings and grounds for an entire class of people that were being very heavily neglected at the time. But thanks to people like Justin Dart, considered grandfather of the ADA, former head of Dart Industries, a company responsible for such brands as Duracell, Tupperware, and eventually merging with Kraft. He was one of the biggest advocates for the movement and is often referred to as the grandfather, again, of the ADA, and he himself was disabled. And alongside fellow advocates, and Mr. George H.W. Bush, who was the sitting president that signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law on July 26, 1990. The new act granted reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities and prohibited discrimination based on those disabilities. The whole background, it's a super cool story. And it'd be hard to believe now, but they were met with strong resistance to these proposed changes. And Dart went on to found the President's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities to combat pushes to weaken the ADA from advocates that would surprise you, and some that maybe wouldn't surprise you. There were protests, there were counter protests, there were demonstrations like the Capitol Crawl, where you had like a bunch of demonstrators abandon their wheelchairs and walking devices, and they crawled up the steps of the Capitol to show its inaccessibility, and then demanded to speak to the Speaker of the House. Jennifer Keelan Chaffins there in the photo on the bottom, and then also in the wheelchair next to Mr. Justin Dart there. She was 8 years old at the time and was one of the biggest advocates and kind of faces of the movement, and she still advocates and speaks about her involvement in the movement, transportation association. She even wrote a book called All the Way to the Top, a kid's book that's kind of cool. And in another instance, while protesting the Transportation Association, the police, in one of my favorite stories of all time, showed up to arrest protesters in Canada because they were going through the same steps that we were at the time and wanted change. And in the funniest and most ironic twist, the police didn't have accessible paddy wagons and had to obtain accessible school buses to arrest all the people in wheelchairs, which I think was just great. The Public Transit Authority was one of the groups that fought hardest against regulations for accessibility and really ended up only slowing it down a little bit. Now here, lastly, with the fresh ink needed to seal the deal, that's HW signing the bill into law alongside Evan Kemp. He was the chairman for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and then Justin Dart on the right-hand side there in a very famous photo with a nice note to Mr. Dart, thanking him for his efforts. And with that, with the history lesson out of the way, which I think is my favorite part. I love learning about this stuff, and it's so interesting. We're going to come to poll question number 1. Hayden, if you would launch that, please.
Yeah, so our first poll question today is, what are you looking to obtain from this webinar? For this one, you can select one option. The options are basic ADA compliance, product recommendations, touchless or hygienic solutions, and CEU credits. A lot of quick responses today. I like to see that. We already have quite a few already in there. We'll still give it a little bit of time for everybody to enter in their answers. Okay, with that, we're going to go ahead and close up poll question number 1. Thank you, everyone.
And let's get into the meat of the presentation. So, the Americans with Disabilities Act, 28 CFR Part 36, Title 3, regarding public accommodations and commercial facilities, and its requirements are enforced by none other than the Department of Justice. Title 3 is our entire focus today, and the following are the key sections of the standard pertaining to drinking fountains and their compliance. Also, remember that Hayden is going to send those slides out to everyone after the presentation so you can reference them later, so you don't have to worry about furiously taking notes, although please feel free to do so. And quickly, since I always get asked, Title II covers state and local government. Title I has more to do with anti-discrimination of disabled employees. Remember also that this is based on an ANSI standard. This is on A117.1. And protects persons well beyond those in an inability or difficulty with walking. Sensory impairment, extremes of physical size, reaching, or manipulation disabilities are some of the other disabilities that this legislation helps to protect, and the goal of it is universal access and design, truly. And a high focus here at Haws too. No exclusion. So what I want to kick this off with is talking about section 36.403, which gives us a list of priorities when making alterations to provide accessibility in a facility. And you're going to notice that in this list, fountains takes a fairly high priority, even over accessible parking. The entrance, the route, restrooms, public telephones, fountains, as well as parking, storage, and alarms are all high priority items and basic human necessities when navigating the world. And I think we can all agree that all walks of life and all people everywhere need water. It's right at the tippy top of the list of things we need to survive, and we need to ensure that it's accessible to everyone. And we are not all equally prepared when we are navigating the world, and making sure that we have all equal access to fountains and water in public is incredibly important, especially in summer months and, et cetera. So Chapter 1, Section 102 just lets us know that this document contains both adult and children's requirements based on average human anthropometrics, which is just a fancy word for measurements and capabilities of the human body. Children are defined in the standard as age 12 or younger. So, and we'll get a little deeper into those requirements as we get further into this. With that, Chapter 2 explains that where there is one fountain, typically a high side fountain, that there must be two fountains. Okay, local building codes determine the number of drinking fountains that must be installed based on occupancy, okay, per capita. This simply states that there must be a high fountain and a low fountain. What most people don't understand is that the low side fountain is not the only one that's designed for people with disabilities. The high side fountain is also a disabled accessible fountain designed for those with bending and stooping disabilities. Folks that may be using a walker, cane, crutches, and similar devices, and may not be physically able to utilize the low side fountain. Okay, so other than aesthetics, really, drinking fountains are not designed for able-bodied people. It's reasonable to assume that you could use whatever it is that you want. So if you're installing a single fountain in your facility or in a park, you must satisfy this requirement first and install a second fountain. There must be one of each. They don't even have to be next to each other. They can be separated or on either end of a hallway, but they both must be present and easily accessible. Now, 211.3 is referred to very simply as the 50-50 rule. Really easy way to remember that. And it simply states that half of the units installed have to be high fountains and the other half have to be low fountains. That's it. So for example, if you're installing 6 new fountains in the building, you couldn't do 4 high fountains and only 2 low fountains. You must provide 3 high and 3 low. The exception to this rule is where the number of fountains yields a fraction. Okay, and you've gone, as long as you've gone above and beyond what it is that you are required to put in that facility, the additional fountain can be whatever it is that you want. So you could have an uneven amount, so long as you satisfies the building's requirements. The 7th fountain could be a high fountain or a low fountain or whatever it is that you wanted. Based on what your design is requiring you to do or what you would like to do. So you can decide what to do with the last fountain, as long as if it yields that fraction and it's above and beyond what was required for the building. On chapter 3, we start getting into dimensional and mechanical elements. You're going to hear me use the term elements throughout the presentation. An element can be any of the devices that we are granting access to. This can be a drinking fountain, fire extinguishers, baby changing tables, and similar devices. And many of the measurements that we're about to cover apply to, again, way more than just fountains, as I had mentioned before. But as you hear me say element, that's what it is that I'm talking about. Now this is one of the most important measurements to remember, as it's frequently the section that's being violated in tear out and reinstalls, redesigns and things like that. So section 305.3 and 305.5 detail clear ground space to accommodate the wheelchair underneath the fountain. Okay, allowing for an approach that's completely unobstructed to the fountain. And you must provide a 30-inch by 48-inch space of clearance underneath that element as it's detailed here on the screen. Okay, which is just larger than your typical adult-sized wheelchair. This gives the user enough clear space for the wheelchair and for their hands to maneuver the wheelchair into that space. Okay, and you can see both a forward and parallel approach there on the screen. Here's a little better. I like this example. I think it clearly demonstrates that the clear floor space in front of the element, whether it be a telephone or I think that's a fire extinguisher, or yeah, on the left, of how it is that you're supposed to approach it and how you're supposed to situate that 30 by 48 inch space in front of the element based on how it is that you're going to need to use the element, what, you know, how the space is built and what's going to be easiest for the approach to utilize it. Now remember that all these measurements are bare minimum requirements. The more space you can provide, the better. When the element is in an alcove, like in the examples above, wheelchair users are going to need additional space to maneuver. That's, I mean, clear. And the clear floor space changes based on both the depth of the alcove and the type of approach. So in our first example there, our 30 by 48 inches becomes 36 by 48 inches when the depth of that alcove exceeds 24 inches. And in the second example, for a parallel approach, if you can imagine that maneuver, when the depth of the alcove exceeds 15 inches, then our clear floor space must be 30 by 60 inches. And more states are requiring the use of alcoves, and it just makes sense for these elements to be out of the path of travel. You know, you have a separate space somewhere where you can go utilize the device that you're putting out of the pathway. And clearly, certainly for a parallel approach, you're going to need a lot more space in that alcove if you're going to turn into an alcove and get deep enough that you can get right up next to that unit. And oftentimes that can be difficult. I mean, it's not easy to get, you know, to a point with that element that you are going to very easily be able to reach it. And it all depends on your disability, on what it is that you're utilizing too, as far as a wheelchair, walker, and things like that. But primarily for a wheelchair, I mean, you really have to sometimes be careful and pretty accurate on how you approach and how you get in there to access this equipment. Now, extending up from the clear ground space that we have defined is our toe and knee clearance. So try to think of this clear area as a three-dimensional space. Our toe clearance is 9 inches from the ground in the bottom of the element, and our from the bottom of the element, and our knee clearance is 27 inches from the ground up to the bottom of the bolt. Okay, obstructions in that highlighted area are another, unfortunately, common compliance issue. I've got some great examples coming up. Hayden's going to show you, and we've found out in the wild that, you know, I mean, it's really quite common to have obstructions inside of this space. People just don't think about it and don't think about how difficult it can make approach with a wheelchair. So this space underneath has to remain clear, and that includes any space between the victim's knees. So if you're thinking about like P-traps, still a little old-fashioned, but hanging phone books or anything else that might be in that space, it's unusable completely. Anything in that highlighted area. And that will bring us to poll question number 2.
Poll question number 2 today is, how important is filtered water to you and or your clients? Again, for this poll question, you can only select one answer, and the options are extremely important, somewhat important, not at all important, and not sure.
I was just speaking at the attendees. There's so many of you here. This is awesome.
Yeah, it's great to see that close to the holidays. It's still getting high attendee rates. Okay, and with that, we're going to go ahead and close this one up as the responses have started to slow down. Thank you, everyone.
And on to section 307. 307 pertains to protruding objects, and it is primarily in place to protect another type of protected class that we haven't really touched on yet, and that class is the visually impaired. Okay, elements may not protrude into a walkway so much and must be located at certain heights, whether they're in an alcove or not, it doesn't matter. Now, this is to prevent anyone with a complete or partial loss of sight from running into those elements. Objects with their leading edge or the lowest point on the front of the element above 27 inches may not protrude a maximum, may only protrude a maximum of 4 inches into the path of travel. But so long as that leading edge of the element is at or under 27 inches, then this is considered to be detectable by a detection cane according to the Department of Justice. Okay, and with how a detection cane is used in public. Now, in this example, we've got our visually impaired amigo here navigating a hallway. On the bottom right, we see an object very similar in some ways to a drinking fountain. And so long as its leading edge, again, is at or below that 27-inch line there, it can be detected through the use of a detection cane, and early enough to be avoided and to help prevent any potential injury to those navigating the space. Now, this fountain and any element, again, so long as it's meeting the 27-inch requirement, can protrude any amount into this space. And the same rule applies for elements at or above 80 inches from the floor. That's considered headroom clearance, and similar to the previous example, can extend any amount into the space. Now on the left, we have an object sitting above 27 inches and below 80 inches, smack dab in the middle, and therefore may not protrude into the space any more than 4 inches unless it's a handrail, which there is an exception for handrails, and they are allowed to protrude 4.5 inches as an included exception. Moving on, I'm just going to use our 1011 here, HPS, and our SK3 cane skirt for the next example. So this is a dual high-low unit, typically installed in your like high traffic, customer facing areas because it's shiny and it looks great. This is a great example of what your typical high-low ADA installation looks like. The SK3 cane skirt is what we need to discuss here. So where drinking fountains cannot be alcoved out of the path of travel, a cane skirt must be used to lower the leading edge of the high side fountain to 27 inches to also make this side detectable. Now, when using a detection cane, if you're unassisted, you're generally following what is referred to as a shoreline or the outermost edge of a space. And since the visually impaired may not be able to detect something on, well, they're going to need to detect something on either side of the room. I mean, if you're following a shoreline, you may be traveling in either direction. And without the cane skirt in place, there will be, very likely, there will be incidents where people will run into a high side fountain, or they'll have a difficult time finding or detecting it, which is why we use the cane skirt. Many states still don't fully utilize and require alcoves, although I think it's going to get there. And until they do, cane skirts are the answer to this issue. They have to be on the fountains, and they will lower that leading edge to the 27 inches, so we are within compliance and they are detectable. Now, Section 308 brings us to reach range requirements. Okay, another important consideration when something like a bottle filler is installed, or when things like baby changing stations are put in place. The slide is pretty straightforward. If your reach is unobstructed, like in the photo there on the left, then you have a 48-inch max, 15-inch minimum reach range. Any buttons, handles, sensors, etc. have to all be located within this range. But as soon as we introduce an obstruction, our reach ranges are diminished. When an object is shorter than 20 inches, then we keep our 48-inch high reach range, but our lower reach range disappears since we now have the fountain or a similar element in place. When reaching over an object that is 20 to 25 inches, our high reach range is shortened even more to only 44 inches, which makes sense. Generally speaking, drinking fountains are shorter than 20 inches, so the middle example will be what our reach ranges are going to be for drinking fountains, usually. Remember, we want to make things as easy as possible and not create a challenge for the user, but just remember those depths and that those reach ranges have to include, again, the buttons and sensors, et cetera, within that range based on how deep the object is. Okay, now the next slide breaks down our children's age ranges and for reach ranges. Now remember, children are defined as age 12 and under. These are all ranges that apply to both forward and parallel approach to an element. So starting on the left, you have ages 3 and 4. You have a 36 high, 20 inch low, 5 to 8, 40 inch high, 18 inches low, and then 9 to 12, 44 inches high and 16 inches low. Obviously, as kids grow, their arm reach grows as well, extending their reach. Ages over 12 are expected to utilize adult height drinking fountains. The only places you'll typically find children's fountains, or where they're most appropriate, is the school system, of course, daycare facilities, and any facilities where many children are supervised by fewer adults. In public, the expectation is just that you're going to have an adult with you, and they can assist. You can assist your children with using fountains and other elements. Now, in Chapter 6, under plumbing elements and facilities, we get into the specifics regarding plumbing elements and their measurements. Now, first off, 602.2 covers clear floor space and the necessity to have that clear floor space centered on the unit, not on the alcove. Okay, this is for a forward approach, as a parallel approach needs to be set up differently. Obviously, our toe and knee clearance must also still be available. There's an exception included here for parallel approaches to children's units, allowing a parallel approach so long as the bubbler or spout is at a certain height and depth. Now, knee and toe clearance begins to diminish pretty quickly as we lower fountains for children's use. So the use of a parallel approach is an important option to have, especially considering that children's use wheelchairs can vary wildly in size and can be even be adult wheelchairs at times. So custom-sized wheelchairs can be they can be expensive. Sometimes they grow with the child, and sometimes they can be expensive. There are programs out there, of course, but you know, everybody's got a different situation, and they can be pretty quickly outgrown. So a parallel approach can help to solve this issue a bit. Again, as we kind of lose that toe clearance, as we're lowering fountains for children's reach and access requirements. So very frequently they're a parallel approach, which is just handy. Now here's a really good illustration of that floor space and how they need to be centered on the elements themselves. As far as the fountain goes, since the clear floor space is intended for the wheelchair user, it's centered on the left low side. And since there's no real floor space defined in black and white, like clear floor space for the high side fountain, the floor space can spill over under the high side fountain as much as is needed. It doesn't matter. Now, many make the mistake of centering the clear floor space on the alcove, which unfortunately leads to expensive tearouts and redesigns of the area. Now, here you can see we have a total width of 48 inches in this alcove wall to wall. It isn't deeper than 24 inches, so we don't need to expand on our 30-inch clear floor space. You will notice, though, that it shows a separate measurement for California. California has gone above and beyond the standard requirements and mandated an additional 2 inches of floor space, bumping up the width of our floor space to 32 inches. So long as the state requirements, again, go above and beyond the federal standards, they can supersede them. So centering the fountain also is not mandatory, by the way, in this alcove or space, but it does make the installation obviously more aesthetically pleasing. If the alcove was deeper than 24 inches, remember that we need a total of 36 inches of ground clearance to allow for more maneuverability on a forward approach. For California, we have our 32 inches and 30 inches elsewhere centered on the low side fountain there. Now, center line to center line, these fountains are separated by 16 inches, which means we need an additional 16 inches of space on either side of the fountains from the center line total to meet our 32-inch minimum for California, and a slightly smaller space in many other states, but it will center that fountain within that alcove perfectly. Now, since there are no obstructions under the high side fountain, our primary concern is just the wall there. And remember, if it is at all intruding into our floor space, the alcove would need to be redesigned, or the fountain would need to be shoved over to the right there to give us more space for our low side ground clearance. Now, doing so will leave it a little off center, but remember, we should, it doesn't have to be centered. And also remember that the high side is also for those with disabilities, and they may need the assistance of walker, crutches, canes, and so on. And we don't need to limit the amount of space that they need to operate those either, even though there isn't a clearly defined floor space for the high side fountain. Although we do have a generally agreed upon number that Hayden is going to cover a little bit later here in the presentation. And that brings us to poll question number 3, and Hayden is going to take it from here.
Yeah, so our third poll question today is, how important is it that drinking fountains and bottle fillers disperse chilled water? So just talking about how important it is for you that they disperse chilled water. And the options here, you can select one of them. And again, they are extremely important, very important, somewhat important, and not at all important.
And Hayden, with that, I'm going to turn over keyboard and mouse control to you.
Sounds great. After this, we'll wrap up the second half of the presentation looking at some examples. There's a little bit of legislation, but not much left. And then we will finish up with our last 2 poll questions and a Q&A at the end. So we're getting into that second half of the webinar here and get you guys out on time, hopefully. With that, we're going to go ahead and close up this poll question. So here we have an excerpt from the California Building Code, which made it mandatory to locate all drinking fountains in an alcove or with wing walls. So where we can't install these drinking fountains in an alcove, we at least need to put wing walls down around the unit. If we are putting them in an alcove, the area needs to be at least 32 inches wide by 18 inches deep. Now, California is not the only state to do this. Other states have done it as well. Texas, Connecticut, and Georgia are just the top of the list. And the main reason for this is to remove our drinking fountains from any pedestrian walkways and to keep them protruding into that path of travel at all. If we have to put wing walls in place because we can't put the drinking fountain in an alcove, we need those wing walls to stick out at least as far as the leading edge of the drinking fountain and within 6 inches vertically of the floor. With that, we're going to hop into some examples. So looking at an example of a drinking fountain in an alcove. Here we actually have an example with 2 high-low drinking fountains in the same alcove. And there's 2 problems with this, but that unit on the far right, the high-low on the right-hand side, is actually fully compliant. There's nothing wrong with that unit. All of our problems come from the unit on the left-hand side. And starting off with that, our first problem is that the low side unit, that wheelchair accessible unit, it's just too close to the wall, doesn't have enough space for our clear floor space. It's being obstructed by that left side wall of the alcove. Because that's the easiest way to make this compliant, we could switch the heights of those 2 fountains, put our low side drinking fountain closer to the center like we have on that unit on the right hand side, and that would give us enough clear floor space. The other problem that we have with this is Justin was talking about reach ranges earlier. Our bottle filler is above our 48 inches maximum high reach range for that bottle filler activation. So that button that's all the way at the top there, that is above our 48 inches. and we would need to move this down above a low side drinking fountain to bring it within our reach ranges and make it compliant. Now let's go back before our next example. Let's revisit the Children Heights drinking fountains, talk about them and their requirements. Section 602.2 gave us a maximum bubbler height for child height drinking fountains of 30 inches. So we can only have the drinking fountain at 30 inches maximum from the finished floor to that spout where the water is coming out of. And that spout cannot be more than 3.5 inches back from the front edge of the drinking fountain either. So just making sure that they can easily reach it. It does allow us to forego our 27 inches of knee and 9 inches of toe clearance, because as we're dropping the drinking fountain down to that children's height, it's going to be cutting into that clear floor space naturally. So we are able to forego that depending on the state. Some states or local building authorities do not allow us to get rid of our clear floor space altogether. They usually specify their own toe and knee clearance for the child height drinking fountains. And then also some state and local building authorities allow for a parallel approach to children height drinking fountains. It's a little bit different than our normal drinking fountains that only require a forward approach, but there are still some states that do not allow for that parallel approach. So we need to keep those in mind anytime we're dealing with children height drinking fountains. So let's look at an example of a child height drinking fountain. This is a very common example that we see. It's a cascading design. It's very aesthetically pleasing. This is what most people go for when they're installing 3 drinking fountains at the 3 heights next to each other. The problem is this one's just installed a little bit out of order. So our high-low drinking fountain is actually meant to be installed only at that wheelchair accessible height for the low side and the standing or stooping disabilities height for that high side. In this example, they installed it at a children's height and a wheelchair accessible height. The back panel on those units have the units too close together to where our clear floor space is being obstructed by that low side unit in this example. In order to make this compliant, we would need to rearrange the order of these, especially if we want to keep that cascading design. What we would need to do is take our high-low unit, move it up and to the right at our wheelchair accessible height and our standing or stooping disabilities height. And then we would need to take that standalone child height fountain and actually put it at a children's height. So we would need to move it over to the left and drop it down, making sure that we're giving enough space for that center unit to have our wheelchair toe and knee clearance and clear floor space of 30 by 48 inches for that forward approach. So let's look at that and talk about how to do it in the correct way, how to install that cascading design and making these units compliant. And with doing so, we're going to be using our white enamel drinking fountains. We're going to have our 1311 standalone and our 1501 high-low. Using the white enamel because that's what we often see in schools. It is still a very popular option in schools. And with that, this is how you would want to arrange these units if you want that cascading design, if you're ever working with the 3 fountains at the 3 different heights. So the key measurements here are that we have our center fountain lined up for our ADA unit. It's at 27 inches of knee clearance there. And then we have our children height drinking fountain off to the right-hand side. It has our bubbler head right below the maximum. It's at 29.8 inches. That maximum is 30 inches. And the key number that we want to install these apart from each other is that 22 inches from center line of that middle unit to the unit on the right-hand side. That 22 inches from center line to center line gives us exactly 15 inches from the center of our wheelchair accessible drinking fountain to that leading edge on the left-hand side of that child height drinking fountain, therefore giving us 30 inches centered underneath that unit for our clear floor space. Now you'll notice that the clear floor space goes under our high side standing or stooping disabilities drinking fountain, that one on the far left. That's completely okay. It's above our 27 inches of knee clearance. Because of that, the clear floor space can go under that. Here we have another common ADA installation issue. The unit here is a Haws 3300 FR. It's a freeze-resistant outdoor drinking fountain. Now, most outdoor drinking fountains are a very similar style to this, where they have our clear floor space forward approach coming up to the unit at 2 different angles. So for our standing or stooping disabilities fountain, that high side fountain, the forward approach is actually going towards the wall, towards that button. For the low side drinking fountain, our forward approach is going alongside that wall. And in this example, our clear floor space is being obstructed by that wall. This drinking fountain is just installed too close to it. It's a very common issue that we see when we're finding these drinking fountains out in the wild, like Justin said earlier. And in order to make this compliant, we would just need to move this unit a little bit further away from the wall. So again, let's go back and look at that. Let's see how to do it properly, show some measurements, and I'll show some different installation examples of where we can be putting it and what measurements we need to keep in mind. For that, I'm going to be using the Haws 3150. It's a concrete drinking fountain. It has an option to either install that arm that's coming off of it at a ADA wheelchair height, or you can drop it down just using that same paneling that's on the side of it and install it at a child's height in case of any playground applications. Again, this unit has that clear floor space forward approach coming from the 2 different angles, so it'll fit up nicely to what we saw that was going wrong in that last example. So if we are going to be installing this up against the wall, we want to keep in mind that we're putting it far enough away from that wall to keep our clear floor space. So for that clear floor space for the wheelchair accessible unit, we need that 30 inches of width. That means, again, we're installing the center of the drinking fountain bowl 15 inches from the wall, giving us exactly 30 inches centered under that unit. And then we have our 48 inches as well in length. We're completely compliant there. And then we have our first example of clear floor space for the standing or stooping disabilities fountains here too. To visual, it shows that you have 30 by 30 inches of clear floor space. That is the generally accepted amount of sufficient space for a person with standing or stooping disabilities. It's the amount of space that we have deemed, or the ADA actually has deemed necessary for a person that's using a device like a walker or crutches to easily come up and access a drinking fountain while using those devices. When we're installing these outdoors, we need to keep in mind that we have to put a hard scope pad around these units as well. We can't have people in wheelchairs or walkers or crutches trying to access these elements on grass or dirt or any type of loose sediment. We want to make sure that we have that hard scope pad down so that they can easily access the drinking fountain. Usually we see that like a concrete pad being put down around the unit, but we need that pad to enclose all of our clear floor space. So for a unit with the clear floor space and the dimensions such as the 3150, we would need 69 inches by 52 inches of that hard scope pad being put down, enclosing all of our our clear floor space, and we would need that path of travel to easily access that low side drinking fountain there on the left-hand side. If we're going to be installing it with wing walls, it's common practice to take these out of the path of travel like we were talking about earlier with the protrusion limits. That does apply to exterior use as well. I saw that question come in the chat earlier on in this presentation, so I did want to call that out in case anybody else had that question. But if you're installing this with wing walls, the wing walls need to protrude out at least as far as that leading edge of the drinking fountain. So in this case, it's 39 inches. And it needs to enclose our clear floor space too. So you see at the clear floor space for that standing or stooping disabilities fountain, our high side fountain, is fully enclosed in there. The wing walls cannot be cutting into that 30 by 30 inches. With that, we have a full lineup of our outdoor models here. As you can see, we have all the different types and styles, different materials, whatever the customer needs to fit the ADA compliance that they're going for. If you need it to fit in a certain space or you need a certain material, We have options for that, even freeze resistant options. And let's move along to our last piece of legislation today. So the last piece of legislation is talking about bottle fillers. And just some quick history on it. The 2010 ADA standards for accessible design come from the ANSI standards. And in 2017, ANSI posted a revision. It's the A117.1-2017. Now, one of the updates that was included in that revision was the addition of bottle filling stations to the Section 602 heading of drinking fountains. The key word there that I'm going to use throughout this is addition. Bottle filling stations cannot replace a required drinking fountain. You can have as many bottle filling stations as you want. They do not replace a required drinking fountain. If you are already meeting the minimum number of drinking fountains you need, you can then replace extra drinking fountains that aren't meeting the ADA compliance that you don't need anymore. You can replace those with the bottle filler, but you have to meet that minimum number first. And with that, bottle fillers have a few of their own requirements. They do still require that 30 by 48 inches of clear floor space for wheelchair accessibility. And if you are installing them above a drinking fountain, it must be installed with forward clear floor space centered on that unit, and it must be centered on our wheelchair accessible low side drinking fountain. If you put a bottle filler on that low side drinking fountain, you're then free to add an extra one above the high side. You just cannot add one to the high side and not the low side. It has to be at least on the low side drinking fountain with that clear floor space centered on it. If you have a standalone bottle filler, one of the unique features about standalone bottle fillers is you can have a parallel approach to them. So they can be forward or parallel approach to any standalone bottle fillers. And all bottle fillers must be either hand operated or automatic. For Haws, we have push buttons for all of our hand operated bottle fillers. And then to meet the automatic side of things, we also have our touchless sensors that can be added to existing bottle fillers or new bottle fillers when they're first ordered. So we want to make sure that we are meeting those minimum requirements with the bottle fillers and keeping in mind that they do not replace a drinking fountain either. And with that, we'll hop into a few examples of bottle fillers, how to install them properly, even looking at a few examples of poor installations where they led to a tear out and a redesign. And for these examples, I'm going to be using the Haws 1920 bottle filler. The reason for that is that they can be ordered up front with new drinking fountains added to existing drinking fountains. They come in different materials to match up to the drinking fountains that you currently have, like white enamel, stainless steel. And then we meet those requirements with both a push button and a touchless sensor on those. So our first bottle filler example today is that 1920 bottle filler installed above a high-low drinking fountain. It's installed directly above that low side drinking fountain, which we know is a requirement. It's accessible to everybody. It's well within our reach ranges. It has the touchless sensor on there, so that fits that automatic portion of the activation. And it also has a bottle rest. We're going to talk about the bottle rests at the very end of this webinar, why those are a great addition, and also talk about some of the requirements that have been coming in on bottle rests as well. So as I was talking about, making sure that everything is well within our reach ranges, if we're installing these above a high-low drinking fountain, this is the measurements that we'd want to follow. We have our bottle filler activator at 46 inches. That is just below our 48 inches of maximum high reach range. And it's installed above that low side drinking fountain. It's all centered, so we would have our clear floor space on it. Everything's at the proper height. Most drinking fountains are about 18 to 20 inches. Because of that, our maximum high reach range is that 48 inches. If you get a drinking fountain that's sticking out more than that 20 inches, because of our protrusion limits, we would need to drop that bottle filler down even lower. Here's an example of an ADA installation issue. We have a bottle filler that is installed above the high-low drinking fountain. It is not installed above that low side. It's also well above our reach ranges. Because of that, we would need to tear this out, install it as a standalone somewhere else, or put another bottle filler that sits a little bit lower to the unit. We also have another example here, 2 different drinking fountains where they got it half right. They installed it above the low side drinking fountain. However, it's still well above that maximum high reach range to the activator. Because that needs to be put as a standalone somewhere else, or we need to install a different bottle filler that sits closer to that unit. Here we have a Haws 1920W above a high-low white enamel drinking fountain. It's a great option for schools. It sits above that low side unit naturally with the back panel that comes with it. And we even offer that as a standalone. So the standalone bottle filler with a drinking fountain, single drinking fountain right below it is a great option if you're adding these as a third child height fountain, or if you're adding it as your standalone ADA wheelchair accessible drinking fountain. If you already have those 2 options, you can even add a third one because you meet all your minimum requirements and put this as your high side drinking fountain. If we are going to be installing that as our third child height drinking fountain, we want to keep in mind the measurements that go into that. For anybody under the age of 12 or 12 and under, according to the ADA, that's the children that we need to keep in mind for child height drinking fountains or any other elements. And if we're talking about that 9 to 12-year-old age range, this is how we'd want to do it. We know based off that table that Justin showed earlier that our maximum high reach range for the 9 to 12-year-old age range is 44 inches maximum. So we have our bottle filler activator here at 42 5/8 inches. And because of that, it's within that maximum reach range. We also have our bubbler head right at 30 inches, and it's less than 3.5 inches back from the front edge of the fountain. This is fully compliant. It's a great example to go back and use when we send out the PDF copy of the slides after the webinar. And with that, we have a example of a high-low drinking fountain with a bottle filler installed at the Reno International Airport, just down the street from the Haws headquarters. This shows proper ADA compliance for clear floor space, reach ranges, and it's aesthetically pleasing. It's all nicely well done and put together. And we want to keep in mind that whether it's in an airport like this, a hospital, a public building, a college, wherever you're installing these, providing for easy access to all facilities and by all people is our primary goal with the ADA standards for accessible design. We hope that the quick guide so far today has demonstrated the key standards as well as how to avoid getting them wrong and making sure that you're installing these properly. We're going to finish up pretty quickly here with our last 2 poll questions, talking about some Haws products and then a quick Q&A since we're running short on time. Our 4th poll question is, how often do you recommend, specify, or purchase a drinking fountain with a bottle filler attached? The options are 75+% of the time, 50 to 74% of the time, 25 to 49% of the time, 1 to 24% of the time, and then that less than 1% of the time. Again, for this option, you can only select one, so just select the one that best applies to you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close out this poll question. So over the past few years, we have taken initiative to provide new hygienic and accessible hydration options. So we're going to go through really quickly, just look at one slide, talk about the activation options, as well as a few other hygienic and accessible products that we've added in. So on the far left side, we have our electric water coolers. The units in that series that have bubbler heads on them, so those drinking fountain heads, those are antimicrobial bubbler heads. They are designed to be ADA compliant. They have several smart features like a bottle save counter, energy efficiency, ability to track the filter life, and it even has a auto purge feature to prevent Legionella growth inside the water lines, flushes those water lines every 24 hours, and it has a tankless water chiller to make sure that there's no sitting water for debris or bacteria to grow in. That's actually very unique. Most people do not have that. Ours is a tankless water chiller inside those. Then in the center, we have our standalone bottle fillers. These are again designed to be ADA compliant. They're all ideal for all types of high traffic areas with options for indoor and outdoor and different materials as well. And then we have our sanitary activation options on the right. We have those touchless sensors that we talked about throughout the webinar. And then we also have our copper push buttons. Copper is broadly recognized for its antimicrobial properties, kills bacteria very quickly when it gets on the surface. Because of that, we just made a cost-effective option to add those to existing units or new units and make them a little bit more hygienic. Those touchless sensors or the copper push buttons, they can be retrofitted on existing units that are already installed or ordered with new units up front. And then we have our last slide before the Q&A. And it looks like it skipped through those last slides. So let's go ahead and talk about the bottle filler stands right here. So bottle filler stands are a great addition to all drinking fountains. Again, these can be added to new or existing units. And bottle filler stands, we're starting to see requirements on them coming down from different local jurisdictions as well as states. The reason for that is that it allows someone to use just one hand to activate the bottle filler and fill up a bottle. That means wheelchair users can keep one hand on the wheelchair and keep it steady, which is a big advantage. It also makes it easier for people with prosthetic limbs to easily use these units. And then let's launch our final poll question of the day. Sorry for flying through this last section. We fell a little bit behind. I hope I'm not talking too fast for everybody. But our last poll question before talking about the Q&A is, would you be interested in learning more about Haws hydration solutions? The options here are interested in attending product webinar, and then schedule a lunch and learn. Thank you everybody for the participation in the poll questions. We've had a lot of participation. I would even say higher than usual based off how quick the responses have been coming in. So we really appreciate that. It helps us gear these webinars as well as what we do with our products in the right direction. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close up this poll question and hop into the Q&A.
Okay, so with that, to start, number one, do the protrusion limits apply to indoor and outdoor placements for objects with a leading edge of more than 27 inches? Hayden, if you would.
Yes, your high side drinking fountain has the lowest leading edge above that 27 inches and it's not installed in an alcove. Then you do need to add a cane touch skirt in order to bring that fountain's lower leading edge down to 27 inches. You can also apply a cane curb, which is very similar. It just gets mounted on the floor, and that does apply to interior and exterior use.
Okay, and for number two, how do I know how many fountains I need for a project?
This is based off of your local codes. It cannot be found anywhere in the ADA standards. Your local building codes are going to determine the minimum number of drinking fountains you need. They usually base that off of occupancy or the type of the building, or some other local jurisdictions base it off a few other factors as well.
And then does the chiller or an electric water cooler interfere with knee clearance?
No, the way that the chiller is designed is in accordance with the ADA standards. Actually, many of the examples that I went through or that Justin even looked at earlier in the webinar were electric water coolers. Those are designed to have the necessary toe and knee clearance, even with that chiller located directly beneath the fountain.
And do I have to have a bottle filler installed?
No. As we talked about, bottle fillers are an addition. They are completely optional, but as we all know, they are a very popular option nowadays. Not everyone carries a bottle or a cup with them, so they don't always have access to drinking water through bottle fillers. Because of that, drinking fountains will remain a requirement because it provides drinking water to all people, even those without a cup or a bottle with them.
People love the bottle filler. Can't throw a rock without hitting a project with a bottle filler on it. All right. Now remember that follow-up email is going to go out to you. It's going to include all of this information, the on-demand recording, CEU instructions, etc. So if you have questions, that email will answer all of those. And expect that from us in a couple days. We're going to put all that material together for you. And then if you have questions, reach out to our customer service team. That's their number there, 775-359-4712, or you can reach out to them via email. Also, our technical support's top-notch. That's their 800 number there on the screen, or tech support at hawsco.com. Basically, if you need to reach somebody, just spell out the department and at hawsco.com. It's a really good way to navigate Haws. We also have a live chat function on the hawsco.com, our website, which is it's killer. We have just the best website. It's really well done. There's tons of information on there. You can get specs and list prices and photos and all kinds of good stuff that you need, and really easy to search and navigate. That's it right there, www.hawsco.com. We're also having our 12-day giveaway right now, and we're giving away prizes, and you could win hydration or safety equipment for your office or home if you want it, whatever it is that you prefer. But we have the QR code there on the screen. If you give that a scan, that will take you to the giveaway, and you can sign up really easily and get a fancy new bottle filler, some emergency equipment, etc. And that's it. Thank you. And please take what you've learned today, go forth, share this information, and remember to be champions for compliance and universal access. Reach out to us here at Haws if you have any questions or if you need anything. Thank you, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you,
Hayden
everybody.
and thank you, Justin and Hayden. Thank you so much for this excellent presentation today. We greatly appreciate it. I learned quite a few new things today, so thank you. I just want to thank everyone for being in attendance. We appreciate you being here. I know it's a busy time of year for everyone. And lastly, just a couple of quick reminders for you. You will receive an email from AEC Daily within the next 24 hours with a link to download your certificate. Your credit will be reported, if applicable, in the next 10 business days. And if you're still struggling to get your credits in by the end of the year, if you're feeling that crunch, please visit www.aecdaily.com for over 1,000 courses that we have available through webinars such as today's amazing one, or also courses on demand. So thank you, everyone, and we hope you have a wonderful, happy, healthy holiday season. Take care.